The bad things seems to be that we suddenly decided that everything was intellectual and there was nothing else. And it goes against all of human history, right? And all of human experience, and actually lived human experience in many of our cases as well. So it's such an interesting thing that it seems that there's this desire to separate and to compartmentalize when it's you really can't at the end of the day, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that, I mean, it's something that comes up in all of the interviews for the Grit Factor. Every general officer, and I sort of think of you in that, you're in the general officer realm, but in the Episcopal Church, is that all of them, although they held these positions that were very solitary and at the kind of the top of, you're at the head of the Spokane Diocese, that none of them did it alone. And they would all talk to that piece. And so how, as you have gone through your journey, and this has been, whether it's academia or whether it's in the firefighters, it's a bit more evident. It's a bit more like what we talk about in the military. But now in your religious life, how do you think about that team? And have you consciously structured it, or is it just part of the environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the most common complaints among clergy is isolation and loneliness.
Yes.
And so one of the things that I did early on is I said in my life, I did not want to be that person who feels isolated and lonely. And the reason why they do, by the way, is if you have a congregation, usually with one cleric.
Sure.
And that cleric has a different role from the people in the pews.
Yes.
And so while you're in a community, they're not doing the same thing. You're not called to be the same thing. Yeah. And so there can be isolation with nobody else. Who's my colleague?
Right.
And so you have to work harder to find that colleague, because you're often the only person doing that task.
Right.
And unless you break down the barriers of denominationalism, you're often the only church in that town.
Right.
In that denomination. Right. And so you have to find ways to be together.
Yes.
And so we try to create structures to help you do that. Sure. So in the church, we have clericus gatherings where the clergy come together once a month. We try to find a clericus gathering in your local town, ecumenically, to do Bible study together, have accountability groups together, do what you need so you don't feel isolated and lonely. Sure. And then in the diocesan level, we have times when we come together as a clericus as a whole, all the clergy of the diocese, for retreat, for conference, for convention, for meetings, things like that. And to just say, yes, you might be the only one in your town with your particular role, but you're not the only one trying to follow Jesus.
Right. Right.
So how do we do this? Right. You're not the only one facing these issues. You're not the only one you're never the only one. And I think when I realized it really is hubris to say nobody understands.
Sure.
Right. Then you get out of yourself. You can laugh at yourself and say, okay, where do I turn for the help that I need?
Right.
And how do I create those structures?
Right. Because
they do exist. They're just not necessarily as obvious in the church as they would be in the military or in the fire department.
Right. One of the big conversations in the business world right now is around mentorship and the importance of mentorship, not just in new roles, but actually as you continue to progress through your role. And this goes a bit to the isolation in a sense. It's not as collegial, I think, as a colleague would be. But how does the church think about that relative to mentorship of either new priests or established priests?
Yeah, so that's another place where we are really trying to work really hard on that. So in our diocese, we require all new clergy within their first 5 years of ordained life have a mentor. Uh-huh. And then any priest that comes into a new call, regardless of how long they've been ordained, is in a year-long program with other people in new calls.
That's Facing the Wind, Season 2 of The Grit Factor. Thank you for being here. As always, it's great to have you listening in. And if you enjoyed this episode, would you subscribe, leave us a review, and share with a friend? And make sure to pick up your own copy of The Grit Factor for candid stories and lessons from leaders in the vanguards of their fields. If you have a question you'd like to ask, send me a voicemail through the link at my website at thegritinstitute.com/podcast. See you next week.